Hi there, I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is going to be the nonfiction on Booktube tag. I was tagged by Cousin from Always Doing, and this tag was created by Olive from A Book Olive, who's also the nonfiction November person. I will link to both of their videos below. There is massive construction going on in front of my house right now, so I'm gonna have to edit together two different versions of this video because the background noise does get picked up on the camera every now and then, so if I suddenly change angles and clothing, that is why. Question number 1 is, how much nonfiction do you read? Of the items that I track on Goodreads, which are generally books that I would read in their entirety, not necessarily front to back, but all of, about half of the material that I track is nonfiction. But in my day-to-day life, I do think I read quite a bit of things like journal articles, magazine articles, newspaper articles. I flip through reference books, guides to things, repairing your car, repairing a fence. I have a couple of cookbooks that I go to regularly, so even though I would say that half of my Goodreads tracked reading is nonfiction, it's definitely more than half of my reading in general, because yeah, I read so much nonfiction in life in general. Question number 2 is, what kind of nonfiction videos do you make or do you want to make on Booktube? I tend to generically do a lot of wrap-ups, so any given wrap-up tends to average out to being about half of the material in any wrap-up. A few times I've separated things out. So I did do a couple of videos this year where I read several books on a theme, so that were nonfiction. I did one that was arts material, another that was food-related material. I know a couple of years ago I did a run of nonfiction that was all about, at least peripherally associated with neuroscience, but in general I just add things to regular wrap-ups, so it's not necessarily anything separate or different from what I would do to talk about fiction. Question number 3 is, what is your favorite subgenre of nonfiction? I mean, one of my favorite things to read about, of course, is First World War history. A lot of that is, even though this isn't really my house and most of my stuff is in storage, I still have piles of that behind me. Although I'd say at this point in my life, I don't necessarily read a huge volume of material about that, just because I've read so much of it in the past that now if there's something new that's doing a new study of somebody's life or some particular battle, or there's some new information that's come out, I'll pick that up. But I'm not necessarily reading a lot of general material about that now. This year, I haven't run the numbers now, but I wouldn't be surprised if memoir was my highest genre this year, just because I have been picking up quite a few of those, and I've both read and listened to a number of audio ones this year, so yeah, I haven't done the numbers, but I wouldn't be surprised if that's currently in the lead. Question number 4 is, do you have a favorite nonfiction book? I feel like that's a weird question because I have a really old copy of the Fanny Farmer cookbook, which is just a big, thick cookbook, and that is super useful. I've been using that regularly for 15 years. Like, I have a secondhand copy that I got somewhere, and it's great. I don't know that I would call it my favorite to read, but it is functionally. I also have a huge encyclopedia of the dog, but that, again, was something I got at a garage sale that was about 25 cents, and it's a book from the 60s, I think. And it's a book of dog breeds and dog training methods, and it's incredibly in-depth. It's a big, thick book, and that's been incredibly useful just socially, because I spend so much time at dog parks. So anytime you see a new dog, you can look up the breed and find out all kinds of information about what they were like before kind of current pet trends, when everybody crossed everything with a poodle. In terms of things that I've reread, though, I would say Jared Diamond's The Third Chimpanzee is the piece of nonfiction that I've reread the most. That is a collection mostly of things that he wrote for Discover in the late 80s, and is mostly about human evolutionary biology, sort of, and human population biology a bit. Question number 5 is, what do you think keeps people from wanting to read more nonfiction? I said something along the lines of this in the comments on Olive's video, which is that I think people actually read more nonfiction than they talk about on Booktube. I think even a lot of the channels where people seem to only be talking about literary fiction or only talking about YA, a lot of those people, if you look on their shelves, they have things like travel guides on the shelves, or they have coffee table books about their favorite band or artist or TV show or video game, things like that. And those are nonfiction. They don't necessarily review them or talk about them in the same way that they're talking about the fiction that they talk about, but they definitely have those on their shelves. And I mean, even people who don't, you definitely sometimes see people, they'll announce that they're pregnant, and if you follow them on Instagram, they're reading What to Expect When You're Expecting or The First 5 Years or books like that. I mean, some people do talk about cookbooks. There's Cook, Read, Create, for example, has it right in her channel name. But I think there are a lot of other people who do read and use cookbooks but don't necessarily talk about them too. So I think it's less that people don't read nonfiction, it's that they don't necessarily read the kind of pop science or pop history nonfiction that I think a lot of I think a lot of people for work have to read, you know, Who Moved My Cheese and What Color Is Your Parachute and Strengths Finder. Like, I used to have to read stuff like that for our team building activities. When I was in a corporate position, we had to do stuff like that all the time. So I think lots of people are reading stuff like things like that. They just don't necessarily talk about it on their channels. I don't know, I think the question is more, why don't people talk about that kind of reading on their channels? I mean, some people definitely do. I think Somda Says So talks about coffee table books all the time. She doesn't post as frequently as she used to, but I'll link to her below. There are some people who talk about business books and travel books, but they are few and far between and don't overlap as much, I think, with mainstream booktube, and I don't really know why that is. Question number 6 is, why do you like nonfiction? And the answer is because I'm curious about the world. I'm always baffled by people who don't read nonfiction, because at the very least, surely you want to know something and you at least look it up on Wikipedia, then maybe look at the references and click on the references and see where those go. I mean, who isn't curious about the world? I think we should all be curious about life and the world and everything. Question number 7 is, what's a nonfiction book that you read because of Booktube? I think the one thing that Booktube really got me into doing, I was always kind of a snob about public figure memoirs, and watching people talk about the experience of listening to audio versions that are read by the actual public personas recounting their personal stories kind of converted me to that, and I do listen to quite a few of those now, and I was always quite a snob about that kind of thing before. So yeah, those are definitely something. I think lately probably 1 or 2 every couple of weeks. I completely blame those on Booktube. Not necessarily because booktubers talked about the specific ones that I listen to, although often that is true, but just by virtue of my mind was opened up to that and I stopped being a snob about it. So, question number 8 is, what is the best nonfiction book that you've read lately? Well, last night I finished Tanya Talaga's All Our Relations, which is a look at the suicide epidemic in indigenous communities, primarily in Canada, but also a bit in Brazil, the US, and Norway. And it's depressing, but I think it's important information to have, to think about the discussions, especially in Canada. There's a lot of talk about Indigenous and settler communities and the whole idea of reconciliation and how can you do that when the communities aren't equal. So I think it's useful information. In terms of enjoyment, about a week and a half ago, 2 weeks ago, I read About Us, which is a collection of the essays that appeared in the disability series from the New York Times. And I thought that was a really great, solid collection. Because I think collections like that with multiple authors are often a little uneven, but the way they were selected, it worked really well together. So that was a really good stuff. Another one of my new favorites is the work of Svetlana Alekseyevich. She is a writer from Belarus who won the Nobel Prize, so her books have been translated into just about every language. They are originally written in Russian. And are social histories. They're always described as oral histories because they take the format of interviews that she's done where she takes out the interview questions, so you get these monologues from people who have lived through different things. Question number 9 is, what are some of your nonfiction reading goals? I don't particularly have any. Well, actually, I guess what I should be saying is that because it's Nonfiction November, and I usually read about 50% nonfiction, I should make sure it's higher than 50% this month, because the goal is to read more nonfiction. So there we go. That's a goal. Question number 10 is, what's your advice for incorporating more nonfiction into your reading diet? And I think my only answer would be, if you're looking at something on Wikipedia, go look at the references and see if there are any books in there and pick them up. Because why not? Get some more depth to that. Because surely everybody's curious about something, right? I mean, what I would really say is that people who mostly talk about fiction, I bet you do read nonfiction. Because, like, you have to read the manual for your car at least, right? And I think people should just be more open to talking about that kind of thing. Don't be embarrassed about the self-help books. Don't be embarrassed that you're reading a diet book, if you are. Yeah, talk about it. The bonus question is to give some recommendations of nonfiction booktube channels that you love. In addition to the channels that I mentioned earlier, I think both Fariba from The Medieval Reader and Brian from Bookish in their versions of the tag came up with some great lists of people who talk about nonfiction on Booktube, so I will link to both of their videos below. And additionally, I'm going to link to 2 videos that I think are great use of applying the knowledge one gains in nonfiction. The first of which is a recent video from Ariel from She Wants the Diction. She recently went thrift shopping and picked up a book that was a cookbook from the 1970s designed for hippie stoners. And she made some of the terrible recipes from it. So I'll link to that video below. And then earlier, another slightly more serious applied nonfiction video. Laura Fry read a book about hangover cures and decided to put the hangover cure in the book she was reading to use. So she went out to a concert and drank heavily and then shares what she learned with us. So I will link to her video below as well. Because I think that's the entertaining side of anything that has practical applications. So that's the end of this tag. And so thanks to Kazan for tagging me, and thanks to Olive for creating the tag and Nonfiction November. And as always, if you haven't done this tag but you would like to be tagged, please consider yourself tagged. That's it for now. Ciao.